completing the accounting cycle. This video focuses on just the worksheet. Chapter 4 focuses on completing the accounting cycle. This video focuses on the worksheet. Sometimes students are intimidated by the worksheet because it has so many columns. The worksheet has 10 columns, but these 10 columns can be broken down into 5 sets of 2 columns. You'll see that there's a debit and a credit for the trial balance. There's a debit and credit column for the adjusting entries. There's a debit and credit column for the adjusted trial balance. There's a debit and credit column for the income statement, and there's a debit and credit column for the balance sheet. So even though there are 10 columns, it's really 5 sets of 2, and even though it looks intimidating, it's probably one of the most easiest things you're going to do this semester. We can start looking at the worksheet by looking at the first set of 2 columns. So let's look at the unadjusted trial balance columns. These columns are nothing more than the trial balance that you wrote on chapter 2, and it's now being written on this different paper, this paper that has 10 columns. As we continue to look at the worksheet, let's look at the next set of 2 columns. The second set of 2 columns is titled Adjustments. So these are the adjusting entries that you learned in chapter 3. We're going to start by focusing on the supplies adjusting entry. So here you can see the adjusting entry as it's written on the worksheet. The supplies account gets a credit and supplies expense gets a debit, just like we did on the journal paper. It's exactly the same as chapter 3. Except now in chapter 4, we're writing it on a worksheet and we're presenting it in a vertical format rather than a horizontal format. When we look at the adjusting entry for supplies, you can see we've entered a debit to supplies expense and a credit to supplies. This is exactly the same as the way we wrote it on our journal paper, except now we're showing it in a vertical presentation. When you are finished writing all of the adjusting entries, notice that the total of the debit column equals the total of the credit column. Also notice that there are letters in parentheses to the left of each of the numbers in the adjustment column. So, for example, take a look at accounts receivable. The $500 debit in the adjustment column has a letter D in parentheses. The letters are in the adjustment column to help the reader find the debit and the corresponding credit for each journal entry. So now find the D in parentheses in the credit column. It's a credit to fees earned, and that's exactly what you learned in chapter 3. The next set of 2 columns in the worksheet are the adjusted trial balance columns. You calculate the adjusted trial balance column by starting first with the trial balance and then adjusting those numbers by anything in the adjustment column. So if we start by looking at the accounts receivable row, in the unadjusted trial balance we have $2,220 and it's sitting in the debit column. Under the adjustment column we have another debit of $500. Since they're the same, we add them. A debit and a debit, they're the same, so we're going to add them. The result then in the adjusted trial balance is $2,720. Let's do one more. So let's look at supplies. Supplies starts with a $2,000 debit balance. In the adjustment column, there's a credit of $1,240. So now we have a debit and a credit. They aren't the same, so we're going to subtract them. And the result in the adjusted trial balance is $760. The other thing I want you to see on this screen is that every set of 2 columns balances. So your unadjusted trial balance balances, the 2 columns in your adjustment column balance, and the 2 columns in your adjusted trial balance. The remaining 4 columns on the worksheet are titled Income Statement and Balance Sheet. And the purpose of the worksheet is to help you create your financial statements. So now to finish out these last 4 columns, what you have to do is transfer the numbers from the adjusted trial balance over to the correct column, either a debit or a credit in the income statement or a debit and a credit in the worksheet. And you can see up towards the top, I've indicated how you transfer the numbers over. The debit column of the income statement will list all the expenses. The credit column of the income statement, the revenues. In the debit column of the balance sheet, the assets and the drawings, and in the credit column of the balance sheet, the liabilities and owner's equity. So all you have to do is take a look at the titles and identify their type, just like we've been doing since chapter 1. And you can see that I've done that all the way down. For each title, I've identified the type to the right of it. Once I've identified type, that tells me exactly where I'm going to place the number in the final 4 columns. Once you've transferred all the numbers over to the final 4 columns, the next step you take is to add each column down vertically. And once you finish that, notice that the debit of the income statement column doesn't match the credit in the income statement column, and the debit in the balance sheet column doesn't match the credit in the balance sheet column. However, the amount that each column doesn't balance by is the same amount, and that dollar amount represents either net income or net loss. Notice also, if you need to place the number in the debit column of the income statement to get your columns to balance, then it will have to be placed in the credit column of the balance sheet. When you are finished with your balance sheet, notice that all sets of 2 columns balance.